Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Letourneau. I'm a partner at Blank Rome. I've been there since 2013. I am a Coast Guard Academy grad and a College of William and Mary grad. So I was in the Coast Guard. You still can't hear me? Okay, well, I'm going to start speaking up. I'll get right up to the mic. So I graduated at the Coast Guard Academy back in 1980, served aboard ship, worked at the Department of Justice in the Aviation Admiralty section, and then got out of the service back in 1996, and we started our own maritime boutique practice, and I joined Blank Rome in 2013. So I've been practicing law a long time. But it's a privilege to be here with you this afternoon. We've got a delightful panel. We're going to start with Andrew Cross in a moment. We had hoped to have Michael Sanders join us. Michael is one of our tax partners in our Washington, D.C. office, but unfortunately yesterday he came down with a case of food poisoning and he wasn't able to make the flight. However, Michael's PowerPoint presentation is very detailed about the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm sure he would be pleased to talk to anybody about tax credit issues as they relate to renewable energy, once he gets better, of course. I was lucky enough back in February to attend the Institute for Energy Law's conference in Houston I guess it was over in Midtown. Brad Crabtree, the DOE Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy and Carbon Management spoke. He is very enthusiastic about the prospects for carbon capture, and he said that it is poised for commercial liftoff. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that carbon capture faces in the U.S. this afternoon. Currently, there are 13 at-scale CCUS commercial demonstration projects. There's 5,200 miles of CO2 pipelines across the United States, and 200 projects have been publicly announced. Mr. Crabtree spoke about the importance that the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act are to that effort, and which our first panelist, Andrew Cross, is going to address momentarily. Importantly, he also mentioned 4 challenges that CCUS faces. The first of which is many companies do not want to invest in carbon management, especially in the power sector. DOE's loan guarantee program, which has $8.5 billion of available funds, but historically, industry has not sought out loans from DOE. The second issue that he mentioned was permitting for geologic storage. The tax credit has a 10-year window. It's rapidly rising permit applications. There are now 125 that are pending. The primacy for issuing those permits is EPA. There have been Class 6 permitting just granted to Louisiana and North Dakota, and Texas is seeking permitting authority, but the permitting process is very slow and very cumbersome. The third challenge is growing local opposition to energy infrastructure projects from farmers, ranchers, communities, and environmental groups. The CO2 transmission lines are some of the safest infrastructure projects, and industry is having to convert existing pipelines rather than building new ones because of the opposition to the construction of new pipelines. And DOE has also revamped how it funds projects, putting community benefits at the heart of projects, which also could complicate issues. And the fourth, and probably the most severe, is the IEA says that we need to get 1 gigatons of CO2 capture by 2030 to have a chance of keeping to the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. Currently, the Responsible Carbon Management Initiative, which involves 20 countries collectively, have only captured 50 million tons to date. So we've got quite a ways to go. So with that backdrop, let me introduce Andrew Cross. Andrew is a seasoned derivatives and investment management attorney in Blank Rome's Pittsburgh office, and he represents financial institutions, commodity trading firms, public companies, and other corporate end users, registered investment advisors, registered investment companies, and private funds. He routinely negotiates complex derivatives transactions and related trade agreements, so that clients can achieve their investment and risk management objectives. On the regulatory front, Andrew's practice covers issues arising under federal statutes that govern the use of derivatives for investment or hedging opportunities. He routinely advises clients regarding the application of the Commodity Exchange Act, the Securities Act, the Investment Advisors Act, and the Investment Company Act. And this afternoon, he's going to give us a broad overview of funding mechanisms under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act as they pertain to carbon capture projects. Andrew?
Is this working? Yes. Okay, great. You can hear me. Thank you. So my background is in investment management and derivatives. That means that I spend a lot of time around money and how money moves. I am certain that a lot of you know much more about energy policy and environmental stuff than I might, but if I can help you understand the business of the laws that are in front of us, that would be my objective. Of course, everybody's familiar with the Paris Accord. What you may not know is that Pittsburgh is called the Paris of Appalachia, and so I'm uniquely positioned to talk about energy and environment. So anyway, what's here? 1 second. Okay, so the slide that you don't see is a slide that I put in this morning. I'm going to talk to you about this slide in a second. There is a carbon management reduction and removal body of law that did not drop out of the sky in 2021 and 2022, but it does feel like it did because of the amount of popular press, for lack of a better term. Going back to 1997, by the Department of Energy estimates, there's been research and development in carbon reduction. And certainly there were earliest involved coal-fired power plants and underground storage of carbon. The Energy Policy Act, or the Energy Act, I should say, of 2020, which is not often mentioned, took that approximate 20-year period of energy regulatory law and gave it another dimension that was then expanded through the 2021 and 2022 acts. So you end up with funding, and when you're looking at the funding under the laws, the language of the statutes speak in terms of CCS, CCUS, and CRD, with CCS being the carbon capture and storage, so you store it as a source and put it underground, and I want to come back to that when we think about the community impacts. Utilization and storage, which is where the carbon is captured and then used in a production or a manufacturing process, and finally, removing the carbon dioxide altogether. And so these are themes that are going to run through all of these statutes. And what I will tell you is that what happened with the most recent iteration as it relates to carbon and energy is that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was a $1.2 trillion spending bill, which is an enormous number, of which $12 billion related to carbon capture. And we're going to look at that in a moment. The Inflation Reduction Act added another $370 billion to it. And so keep in mind, from 1997 until this time, 25 years, there have been carbon capture, so it's not something that is entirely new. What is new, and what I would like to emphasize, is that it's an entirely new energy policy because of the community benefit plan that fits into the funding mechanism, which we'll look at in a moment. So what I will do in the next few minutes is, if I do my job as a lawyer, nobody likes me. So if you love community benefit stuff, I hope you learn something and you don't like me. If you hate community benefit stuff, I hope you learn something and you don't like me. But I want to talk about the business of it, because the business of it is very important. There are words that are the administration words to create good paying union jobs, to promote environmental justice. Our other panelists will speak about those, and I will touch upon them in the context of funding. So you have an entirely new energy policy, and you can see exactly the middle blue square is this carbon capture, utilization, and storage. All of this are the energy-related provisions in the Infrastructure Act. But carbon capture is that light blue, purplish blue, whatever, periwinkle blue, I guess, in the middle. It is periwinkle. $12 billion is what that block represents for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The Inflation Reduction Act took that blue box, and there's no comparable that I could find by the Congressional Research Services comparable presentation. So what you have to do in your mind when you're conceptualizing the Inflation Reduction Act is it says, okay, we're going to have now a stated legislative objective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the usage of fossil fuels and transitioning to clean energy. The strategy will be to pay subsidies to businesses, households, local and state governments. And this was done primarily, the way that all of the Inflation Reduction Act relates to the tax credits is that it complemented the funding that was in the 2021 Act by extending the tax credit, the 45Q tax credit. It added an enhanced tax credit for direct carbon air recapture, and it lowered the thresholds for the facilities that are able to benefit from it. This slide is how the Congressional Research Services speaks of the greenhouse gas emissions and the sectoral sources. So the funding mechanisms are speaking about sending money out to address greenhouse gas emissions in these different resources. So the question then becomes, well, exactly how does the money go out? What are the funding mechanisms under all of these laws? There are 4 basic buckets of funding mechanisms. You have grants and loans, tax credits and deductions, and then I'm going to leave the other off to the side for a moment. The difference between a grant and a loan, for those who may not be familiar with federal funding, is basically that a grant does not need to be paid back, but a loan needs to be paid back. The grants are in 2 primary buckets of mandatory and discretionary. Mandatory grants are awarded to all applicants without exception. Discretionary grants are awarded to select applicants. This is really for private industry, it's the discretionary grants. And if you walk away from one thing, I want you to know is that you have to be paying attention in order to make that work, because the mandatory grants are typically only awarded to state and local governments. There are very specific state and local programs that are funded through categorical grants, whereas project-specific grants are what the projects are. Now, those can be either discretionary or mandatory. So again, you have grants that go out, and you typically have to apply to receive a grant and meet the qualifications of the application process, which we'll touch on. The second is a loan, and we're going to touch on the loans. It's exactly what it says. The loans come through a loan program office, which I will show you where that fits into the federal government. And finally, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to have Michael here to talk about the tax credits. Our partner who understands the 45Q tax credits is not available. He's was due to illness unable to travel, but he would tell you that the tax credits are a huge part of the funding mechanism, and I'm not going to be able to touch on that in great detail. I can talk about it a little bit later on. If people have questions, I can try, but we really would direct you to Michael for that. So where does the money come from? The primary federal government agency that's dealing with the funding under these 2 statutes is the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy has 17 offices. If you're a business that wants to obtain money through these statutes, you need to be paying attention to the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, the Loan Programs Office, and the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. So the money's coming through congressional appropriations and authorizations, and the things that you need to be paying attention for with your business are these 3 offices. So what we'll do is to look at them very quickly. This is a recent funding opportunity that the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management put out, which was the $30 million in funding to support carbon management priorities, which was the conversion of carbon dioxide. And the interesting part of this, which I've highlighted in yellow, and I want you to focus on these words, It's to advance the development of the technologies that will help to establish the foundation for a successful carbon capture and conversion industry in the United States. So in other words, this is very much in an early stage, as Keith alluded to, and no doubt other panelists will touch upon. This is an active, by the way, an active funding opportunity that was announced with, it was opened at the end of February and the beginning of April. The Loan Programs Office is another funding mechanism. The Loan Program Office has the mission to be the premier public financing partner that accelerates high-impact energy and manufacturing investments. So it provides what they call a bridge for bankability between clean energy projects and the money. It enables the expansion of the domestic and manufacturing and supply chains, and it seeks to make clean energy transformation affordable and achievable for workers, consumers, and communities who will benefit from the loan program support. So what you see on the bottom are the different stacks of business that the Loan Program Office can fund. And what it does is it funds these programs through loans. And so it was Title 17 of the Energy Policy Act. That's what the Title 17 refers to. And so you basically have energy projects, supply chain projects, state energy financed projects, and this fourth bucket is probably the most relevant one for private enterprise, which are the energy infrastructure reinvestment projects. The green, the orange, and the gray are other funding buckets that are coming through the Loan Programs Office. So what we have on this slide is, first of all, the loans are what you think of. They're loans that are made through this program by the federal government to private industry, or there's a guarantee of up to 90% of the commercial debt, where you would have a private financial institution making the loan and the government backing the loan. This was, according to the LPO itself, this is the amount of funding that was remaining under their loan authority as of January of 2024. And the $60 billion is the energy infrastructure refinancing. And so there's money here, and the question is, why is there so much money here? And I think other people may be able to answer that better than me, but my understanding from talking to people, Keith, as a Coast Guard person, you'll appreciate that Jimmy Buffett says to don't try to describe the ocean if you've never seen it. I've never seen one of these loans. And I think that part of the reason why is that it's cumbersome to apply for them. But those of you in the room may have practical experience having gone through the application process itself. But the money is out there, and there is a Title 17 loan energy program. The other part of funding that comes through the third Department of Energy program is the OCED, which is the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration. There are 9 different, what they refer to as their investment portfolios or their programs that relate to energy funding. Carbon management is where most of the carbon capture is. The funding deadlines for these 3 projects have passed. So there's not money available at the present moment to get money under these 3 projects because they are already, the funding opportunity announcements have gone out and they are funded. They've been spent. So what I would like to do is to walk very briefly through these ideas, which are, if you see, there was an $890 million project in December for a Texas, Colorado, and North Dakota carbon capture, basically capturing carbon at gas-fired power plants and 1 coal-fired power plant. That money is out. And then since then, you see there are 4 other announcements. So why am I showing this? Because there have been a lot of activities, and we get calls from people that say, hey, I want to get my hands on the IRA funding, which is great. But I want you to pay attention to the yellow highlighted material, because that's where it is in the timeline. So before there was December 2023, there was a funding opportunity announcement in February of 2023. You had to submit a letter of intent. You had to submit a full application then in March and May, respectively. And then in December, it was awarded. People tend to pay attention to the yellow highlight, and they don't pay attention to everything that needs to be done in order to be at the table in the yellow highlight. So if I can leave you with one thing, I would like to show you why you need to pay attention to that highlight. Right. So this is the Industrial Demonstrations Program. And I selected this for 2 reasons. First of all, I couldn't find anything for the program that actually relates to carbon capture. It's out there in a YouTube presentation, but I can't find the slide. But the important thing about this slide is not the subject, it's the process. This is where we are. So in other words, in order to arrive at the yellow spot in December of 2023, you're here, right? Look at this. Every one of those dots and diamonds represents what they call a go, no-go opportunity. The go, no-go opportunity relates to the environmental justice considerations, relates to the community benefit plannings. So if I just take one that's, I'll try to be as apolitical as possible with something because this is a very politically charged topic. Carbon dioxide is being put back into the ground. Perhaps it's underneath your house. That may be something that somebody has an interest in. So everybody with a house may be interested in the carbon that's being put into the ground near them. So that's a type of community benefit issue. There are also more political community benefit issues like diversity, equity, and inclusion conditions, and getting that, making that sure that the benefits of the program are flowing back into the communities, which everything that goes from the federal to the local government presents political problems. That's just a reality of America in 2024. So when you take the fact that we've had energy funding for about 25 years, and you combine it with the policy that's underlying it, it truly is a new energy policy, and I will say that, I'll just stop here, it's going to be years before the money moves out of the federal government into the local projects. And if you're a company that's participating in that, you may get to, by the way, prior to the project award, the federal government can tell you, we're abandoning the project altogether at our discretion for no reason or a reason. And once the project is awarded, they have those little diamonds where they can do no-go, no-go, based to a large extent on the community benefits part. So understanding those community benefits is very important, no matter how you feel about them, enthusiastic or otherwise. They are stopping points on the way to project management. So that's it from me, and I'll turn it over.
So yes. Andrew, I do have a question for you, and that is, given the fact that we're still 2 to 4 years away before these projects actually come online, what can we do to accelerate investment in the project selection? I mean, it seems like this mechanism is going to preclude us from achieving exactly what it is we want to achieve.
Oftentimes I say I'm a technician, not a magician. I say it many times a day, and this is one of those examples. The reason why I picked the Industrial Demonstrations Program is because if you were to do the carbon capture program, the slide would look the same. This is the process that the federal government has put in place to manage the authorization, appropriation, and the funding. So how do you streamline government, I guess, is the question. And some people may say you shouldn't streamline government, right? Because of the significance of what's being done to communities.
But essentially what we're looking at then is we've got 13 demonstration projects that are still somewhere between 2 and 4 years before they come online, and those are just demonstration projects. We're not even talking about bringing it up to scale. 4 years from now is 2028.
Correct.
And we've got till 2030 to get the 1 gigaton.
And there are potentially 3 administrations through that funding period. And again, the reason why I started where I started was to say there's been a long history of energy policy, but it was only recently combined to be a new energy policy with what is in the 21 and 2022 Acts, which is why it's important to understand that, and how those extra energy policy considerations factor into project management is going to be very challenging if there are changes in administrations over the hypothetical 13-year period. Right. There's appropriations and authorizations that have been made, and now there's this back and forth. And we heard from the Texas commissioner how even if you have standards at the federal government that get passed down, if there's not authorizing legislation at the state level, it can drop, and the projects can drop in that regard as well. So,
all right, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Professor Chinonso Anozie. He is currently an assistant professor of law at the Willamette University College of Law in Salem, Oregon, but will soon be joining the UH Law School faculty. Unfortunately, he's doing it in August, so that might be quite an adjustment. He teaches property law and various energy and environmental law classes, including a global environmental justice class. Prior to teaching, he was an associate in a mid-size law firm's corporate division in Nigeria, where he worked on energy and environmental issues. As a senior associate, he advised domestic and foreign government agencies on energy trade and environmental law issues. Professor Anozie's scholarship lies at the intersection of energy and environmental laws and regulations, and specifically, he addresses the impact of energy laws, regulations, and policies on energy development in various jurisdictions with a focus on disadvantaged communities. Professor?
I think it's on, yeah. Thank you very much, Keith, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. I will focus my conversation on the Inflation Reduction Act and Justice 40 with a particular focus on disadvantaged communities. And 2 or 3 things I'm going to look at, which is like a tripod stand of my conversation, is to look at opportunities for CCUs in disadvantaged communities, and also look at whether there are challenges involved in siting some of these facilities or retrofitting some of the old and aged facilities that we have in those communities. And I'll talk a little bit about the solutions. So you might be wondering, why are we talking about disadvantaged communities when we're looking at Inflation Reduction Act? If you read the act, it doesn't say anything about disadvantaged communities, so to speak. It's because we are under an administration that focuses on environmental justice and focuses on disproportionate impact and reducing disproportionate impact on minority communities or disadvantaged communities. And part of what the Justice 40 does is to ensure that at least 40% of overall benefits of certain federal climate and federal initiatives at least impact or flow to disadvantaged communities. And I'm going to talk about this later on. But I also want to point out that this Justice 40 is an initiative, but it's implemented, so to speak, via the Executive Orders 14008 by the Biden administration. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Now, when I say disadvantaged communities, what am I talking about? It's not along the lines of race, but I'm using it broadly to include even Native American communities. Not just that, to also include economic communities of low-income communities. And I also take a look at what the census tract defines disadvantaged communities as such communities that have been marginalized by underinvestment and also overburdened by pollution. And any community, so to speak, could be under any of this. And it also includes any federally recognized tribe or tribal entity as a disadvantaged community. And one of the things the Justice Initiative, 40 Initiative does is to ensure that there are certain benefits that flow to these communities. I've said that before. But in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, the administration is focused on increasing the benefits that flow to disadvantaged communities by even adding more taxes, tax credits, as we're going to see subsequently. But like I mentioned earlier, if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act or look at 45Q credits, it's non-discriminatory. It goes to all communities. It doesn't say you have to focus on this community. But what the government is doing is to try as much as possible to increase the benefits that will come to these communities by adding either more tax credits or even adding more funding, which we're going to look at a couple of them and what it does. And why should you, as an investor or someone a stakeholder, invest in any disadvantaged community? Why should you care about that? First of all, because you're probably going to make profit. And secondly, you have qualified facilities in disadvantaged communities. And as a matter of fact, when you look at the data, you have even more of those facilities in disadvantaged communities. And we're going to see what happens, especially in tribal communities. So the Inflation Reduction Act simply strengthens the President Biden's Justice 40 initiative and to ensure that 40% of these benefits of climate and clean energy investment go to communities. Now, there's one particular funding here, which is the Environmental and Climate Justice Grant Program. This is not available to private investors, but it's also available to nonprofit organizations or even local city councils or even counties. But it must be, even if you're a nonprofit organization and you want to take benefit of this particular grant, you must partner with a local city council. So it's also one of those areas where nonprofit organizations could also partake in investing in local communities, especially in building carbon sequestration and storage facilities. But besides that, there are also other opportunities that we have in disadvantaged communities where the government has made funding available. If you're not aware, we're going to go through a number of them. And I think Andrew has mentioned a couple of them, but I'll try to avoid the ones Andrew talked about. So you have the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. What does this fund do? It's used by the Environmental Protection Agency to provide grants for clean energy and climate projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the opportunities that I'm talking about here are the opportunities that are indicated to do what? To reduce pollution or greenhouse gas emissions, especially in disadvantaged communities. Those are the ones I'm talking about here. And it says that it should focus on supporting low-income and disadvantaged communities. This is also open to the private sector. For those who want to invest in this area, if you meet some of the requirements, which is always cumbersome, definitely you can take advantage of this grant. Another one here is the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program, which is a loan. That might not sound very good, but it focuses on projects that are retooling and repowering or repurposing or replacing energy infrastructure that is no longer in use. And this is also an opportunity that investors and also stakeholders in the field can take advantage of. And what it's trying to do is also enable operating energy infrastructure that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And you could reduce this with building any other type of, retrofitting any facility that increases greenhouse gas emission. And importantly here is also the investment tax credit, which the Inflation Reduction Act also modifies. So what it does here is to extend the production tax credit, which is something we've had previously, and the investment tax credit through 2023 to 2024. And although this is not specifically under 45Q, it's under 45Y and U. So what it says is that after 2024, it will now be replaced with technology neutral and emissions-based credits, and a clean energy production tax credit, and also clean electricity investment tax credit. And the goal is to incentivize investment in disadvantaged communities and ensure good paying jobs. So you see that a number of the opportunities I've mentioned here, or the investment or the loans, as you want to call them, are looking at focusing advantages on focusing these benefits on environmental justice communities or disadvantaged communities, as the case may be. I also have the USDA Assistance for Rural Electric Cooperatives, and the goal here is to help cooperatives that aim for energy efficiency improvements to electric generation and transmission systems, or those who purchase or use clean energy and carbon capture and storage systems. Now I'll move over to opportunities that you have in disadvantaged communities. And when I said that there are several opportunities in disadvantaged communities, this is the slide I was looking at. This is produced by Department of Energy and Fossil Fuel Energy Management. So I don't think you can really see, but if you look at some of the blue, red, blue, those are pointing out geologic storage sinks that we could use, especially in tribal communities. And if I go a step further, which is a better pictorial representation, you see there are opportunities in tribal communities where you could either retrofit or even have opportunities to store carbon and transport carbon. So if you look at a disadvantaged community, sometimes you think, well, there's not much going on there. We might not have to, focus on that. But there are several opportunities that one could also use, could also invest in. And not only that, I will go back You also have this tribal electrification program, which is up to 150 million, but it's focused on tribal and native communities. And that's also an opportunity that stakeholders can make use of, especially in disadvantaged communities. So here you see a number of facilities that you have in native tribal communities, in power generation, refinery, and ammonia, and natural gas processing. These are opportunities to also take advantage of under the 45Q. But that might sound easy, but there are challenges to all of this. And that's where the problem is. It's not about the funding itself, but it's also how to get this done. And one of the ones that sticks out is state and local permitting. And that's one of the things we have to look into. For example, if you look at the Class 6 permitting, the EPA since, under the federal permit program, since 2010, there's only been about 2 permits issued since 2010, and it takes about 26 to 40 months to get one done. But when you look at North Dakota that recently got primacy in Class 6 permitting, since 2021, they've issued 2. So that tells you that when you fast track or remove some of the challenges that you have in state and local permitting, we may be able to get to 1 gigaton faster than we are doing. Another thing is also community acceptance and opposition, and which is someone who practices in that area, invests in that area, will see this often happening when communities either reject some of these programs or decline to have them in their vicinity. And there are also potential risks, which Andrew talked about a little bit earlier. If you're storing this carbon in geologic storage areas, what happens? Is there a possibility that there might be a leak? And if there's a leak, who suffers the consequences? And that's also a challenge and a concern that you also have in disadvantaged communities. And they've had bad experiences with investors and stakeholders before. So sometimes they always recall that, especially when stakeholders are coming. I think recently I saw an official of the Department of Energy talking about one of their demonstration projects where the community rejected that, even though it's just a demonstration project, because they believe that there might be potential risks involved in all of that. And also the legacy of pollution and the distrust of industry practitioners is one of the challenges, or some of the challenges that we're having in citing some of these geologic storage, or citing some of these facilities in disadvantaged communities. And not only in building new facilities, it's also possible for us to retrofit some of these facilities. And you might be thinking, well, it's easier for us to talk to them and say, look, we just want to retrofit a particular old facility. And one of the pushbacks you get is, well, yes, it's a good thing. And it reduces carbon emissions within our vicinity. But doesn't that incentivize more, let's say, natural gas or power plants or other toxic facilities? If that's the case, that might increase greenhouse gas emissions? That's the question or the pushback that you get, especially in disadvantaged communities. But let's look at a couple of the things we could do to solve some of these issues. And it's not a simple issue to solve, it's quite complex. And one of the things in response to my last comment about retrofitting facilities is community engagement and education. You, as a stakeholder, you must be engaged with that particular community in terms of education, telling them with science, backed facts, the impacts, and also the potential risk. If there are ways to minimize that, definitely you have to. If there are opportunities that you have, calling, let's say, stakeholder meetings or council meetings, or where you go and educate members of the community, that has always been helpful, especially in solving community pushback and opposition. Another thing I want to talk about is transparency. And that's one of the challenges we've had over time in terms of previous facilities that have been cited in disadvantaged communities. And sometimes even the government or even stakeholders are not transparent or forthcoming about the potential dangers to help the community prepare in the future. of what's going to happen. But I also want to mention that at the stage of the climate change impacts that we are now, we've gone past the stage where we would assume there wouldn't be any adverse impacts to any community at all. There would be, definitely. But the question is, what are we doing to reduce and ameliorate those impacts going forward? And that's part of the things that community engagement, education, and transparency would do, building resilience in local communities. Another thing is also fast-tracking permitting in the United States, and this has also always been an issue. And pushback that you get, especially from environmental justice advocates, is the expedited permitting procedure does not meet the test of environmental justice. We are not engaging more with communities. We are forcing communities to accept some of these projects. But of course, I teach environmental justice. It's my area. I'm also an advocate. But I don't think that's absolutely true. I think expedited permitting could also be done in a way that reduces the impact on communities as much as possible. Because like I said earlier, we've gone past that stage where we're not going to have any impact as we talk about carbon sequestration and utilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, talking about fast tracking, it looks like the Class 6 permitting, basically taking the EPA's permitting authority and giving it to the states is certainly one way to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, Louisiana and North Dakota have it, and Texas is trying to get it. It seems like that would be one mechanism, but the fast tracking that you were talking about, what regulations did they dispense with in order to expedite the process? And how are we going to do this in order to accomplish what we need to accomplish?
So currently, I think I also forgot to mention this. Currently, you have the proposed Council on Environmental Quality expedited rules, which we haven't even permanented yet, which is also what the government is looking at. But issue now is whether, in talking about permitting, whether you're going to include all of those oppositions on the environmental impact statements. If you're doing environmental impact statements, what are the stages? Do you just do environmental impact statement, then go back to the community and also look at whether there's whether the particular agency has taken a hard look at some of the issues. So shortening the time, which is one of the proposals that they have, which you can take to consider reviews and also public comments on that environmental impact statement, is one of the things that is being proposed, and I also think is one of the ways we could also do that. And on the flip side, this is not just on fast-tracking permitting, but I also think it's what stakeholders could also do on their own part in order to reduce the time that we take in permitting projects, is to lay it bare with the community as to what impacts it would have on those communities and being transparent about that. Because most times the delays with the environmental permitting is also consideration of the comments, consideration of the objections and oppositions that you have coming from local communities. So when you have less of an opposition, you tend to be able to run a faster fast-tracking system.
All right, thank you very much. Our last panelist is David Mora. David Mora is the Vice President of Carbon Solutions at NextDecade. He is an energy executive and investor with a proven track record in transforming overlooked opportunities into value across the energy and infrastructure sectors. His experience spans diverse operational and investment environments, where he has driven success through acquisitions, divestitures, spin-offs, recapitalization, restructurings, and partnerships. David's career reflects a commitment to tackling challenges in both small and large organizations, preparing him to address each new situation uniquely. Currently focused on advancing carbon capture technologies, he advocates for a pragmatic approach to achieving global net zero ambitions, leveraging his broad experience for sustainable energy solutions. So welcome, David. So we're just going to have a conversation here for the last few minutes of our time. Tell us, if you will, what is the business of NextDecade?
Yeah, Keith, thanks for the invitation and the introduction. I think, first of all, NextDecade is a LNG development company. We are developing in the port of Brownsville, 27 million tons per annum facility. Currently, phase one has been FID'd. Phase one is comprised of three trains. It's fully permitted. So all 5 trains are already permitted, and we've got all licenses. So recent moratorium on new licenses will not affect us. It's interesting for those of you who are familiar with project finance, this is going to be no news, but for those of you who are more generalist, I think the interesting thing about these projects, and we're certainly tackling the carbon capture project in a similar fashion, is that it all gets funded. So all the funding for the project that is going to take a construction period of 4 years, it's secured day one. And so that's part of the reasons why some of the things that were mentioned before, where you have a government loan or assistance that may be pulled away at any given point during the 4 years, it's perhaps not able to be included in your capital stack when you're contemplating some of these projects.
So basically, you're relying upon private investment, essentially, and not looking to government loans or grant programs.
100% on the LNG side. The LNG, I would say, is it's a very well-established part of the energy industry. The way those projects work is like you have credit-worthy investors on the offtake side. So it's a project that is as de-risked as one can think of. There are risks still involved, but I mean, you obviously try to ameliorate or isolate as much of them as you can upfront. On the carbon capture side of things, it's a little bit different. It's newer. It was also mentioned before that we've been dealing with carbon capture laws and investments and the physical act of capturing carbon for over 25 years. And that is true, but I think now we're trying to do something that I don't think was ever attempted before. When you think about, let's stick to LNG plants or natural gas processing facilities, the CO2 has always been stripped out of those feedstock gases for different reasons, but there is technology that is 60 plus years and it's able to do that. So you got a gas that has a certain percentage of CO2 in it. So there is technology through chemical processes to extract that. There's nothing new in that, but now we're using it in flue stacks, which the difference is very low concentrations and very high temperatures. And the reason to do that is not because we're gonna generate a product that we can sell, but it's just because we're doing it for environmental reasons, which was never part of the economic optimization during the past 100 years, right? So we got to where we are now through a process of optimization where economic interests were driving prosperity, right? It's like you got companies that are trying to provide the lowest source of energy you can, and that low cost source of energy spurs economic development, and economic development comes along with well-being for disadvantaged communities and other communities alike, right? But now we're doing this just for environmental elements. And so it's just a new element to the optimization equation that needs to be factored in.
But
so,
where is the investment potential when you're dealing with, strictly an environmental problem? Who's your customer?
Yep. And so that's very interesting. So who's the customer? So when I transitioned, my background was mostly oil and gas. So we were producing hydrocarbons and fossil fuels and generating CO2. When I decided to transition in around 2020 during COVID was because it seemed to me that this time around everything was different. I tried to get involved with renewable energy in the 2008-2009 timeframe, but it didn't seem like everything, all the pieces were together at that time to make it work. It certainly did, and we can see now how the renewable energy industry has grown tremendously and the costs have come down, and there is a lot to be said about everything that has happened in that industry. But it didn't feel to me, what felt to me is like the demand for it was not necessarily there. 2020 came around, and I certainly saw a shift in the way that people were perhaps not even asking, but more so demanding that environmental considerations were part of the discussion. And not only at the civilian level, but government levels and private enterprise levels. So we saw things like the Climate Pledge, for example, sponsored by or started by Amazon. How quickly signatories to the pledge grew. And that's just one. I mean, we can go around and look at the number of companies that have today net zero or environmental pledges. Some have it to 2030, to 2050, and different scale of ambitions, but that just took over, right? And so who's your customer? I thought, perhaps very naively, that the customer is the population. Like everybody wants it, like at all levels, government, civilian alike, enterprise, big and small. Reality is that yes, people want it, but the real question to ask is who's willing to pay for it? And that's when the conversation gets really, really tricky. So today, there are two pockets that could provide the level of investment required for these projects to go forward. The biggest one is what we were talking about, the 45Q. And there are many other tax credit incentives that relate to energy industry, to renewable energy industry, and many different verticals, but the 45Q is specific related to carbon capture. And even that is split into two, but we can get into that in a little bit. The other one is the carbon markets. So because of all those pledges that had been announced or corporations have been committed to, there is a market that is growing at a fast pace and it's established and it has been around for a long time, but I think it's taken off at a different pace in which you can place your environmental attributes, in this case, a carbon credit from CO2 that you remove from the atmosphere and get paid for it. And so to me, those two are the most significant sources of financing for these type of projects.
So let's talk about for that just a second. In terms of the investment potential of the credits that are being created in the private sector, like through Amazon, as you mentioned, isn't most of that going for projects like direct air capture as opposed to putting equipment on flues to capture emissions?
100%.
And so, what the question I have there is, how effective is that to society in general, in your estimation, based upon your experience at NextDecade?
It's incredibly impactful, and I think, and perhaps I should have a disclaimer, right? I think everything that I'm saying here has a personal bias. I mean, I look at things from one angle, and I try to be objective and understand, multiple points of views. But, to answer your question, I think the challenge is there's a lot of this that is driven by ideology. And people are being very dogmatic when it comes to what are we doing about the environment. So to me, pragmatism would dictate, let's look at what is it that we're producing, right? And so whether it is steel or it is energy, you can look at the carbon intensity of it and focus on that metric. So if you're driving that metric down, you're doing good for the environment. Instead, I think what's happening is, there is an objective, and instead of having the objective and looking for the right answers to do that, to get there, you're putting your preferred solution together with your objectives and hoping that you will get there. I personally think we're putting the cart before the horse. When it comes to these type of situations, for example, why should one look at the source of the emission as opposed to the impact that I'm causing? And what do I mean with that? If I am avoiding a ton of CO2 from going into the atmosphere, that's a ton of CO2 that will then not have to be removed from the atmosphere, right? And so when I go to, let's speak on Microsoft. If we go to Microsoft in their supplier qualification criteria, you would see one clearly spelled out that will prevent you from even trying to engage with them if the source of your emissions is related to fossil fuel.
So when we talk about that, tell us, if you would, what is the effectiveness of removing emissions at the source with the flues versus a direct air capture project?
That's one of my favorite ones, right? So I think, let's talk about direct air capture. and where that is. I think, you have few projects operating today, and the concept sounds fantastic, right? So I think, and it has many advantages, to be perfectly honest, right? Like, I think the first one is you can place it at the most convenient place there is. So you can go to those saline aquifers that were shown in the slide before and place these facilities right on top of it. So you don't have to transport any of this CO2 across communities or in anybody's backyard. You can also pick where you're going to place them in sense of, like, we're not going to put it under anybody's house. We're just going to put it in an open field, for example, right? So those are clear advantages from these type of projects. The disadvantage is where the technology sits today and what you're trying to do. If we think about producing hydrocarbons, we've been doing that for 100+ years. So there is an optimization process that has gone day after day for a very long period of time to get us to where we are, and we're able to produce hydrocarbons today at the cost that we are. For example, when I started in the oil and gas industry, I read the first book, and in my first week, okay, now I'm an expert. You look for sandstones or limestones, and shales are bad. You will never produce out of a shale. Today in the United States, we're producing mostly out of shale, and that happened in a very short time span, right? So none of that has happened in the carbon management space. So if you look at where DAC is, you're trying to remove carbon from the atmosphere, and it's concentrated at a 4 ppm, right? So we're breathing this stuff, and it's toxic gas. We're breathing it in such a low concentration that doesn't affect us. Well, that's what we're trying to remove out of the air, and it's very costly. So if you compare that to a point source, and just to put a comparison, you're going from 4 ppm, if you're talking about a natural gas facility, power generation facility, you could be in the 3 to 6% concentration range. So look at that jump. And if you're going to a coal facility, you're going to 10 to 12%, as high as 10 to 12%. So it's orders of magnitude different, and that drives the cost. So if you go back to what I was saying, we can avoid a ton of CO2 from going into the atmosphere, and we can do that at a 6 to 8 times lower cost than we can do it in a direct air capture facility. That seems to be the most rational option if capital is a constraint, right? And capital is always a constraint.
So we're just about out of time. And one last question I wanted to ask you is, have you been using the tax credits that are available through the IRA at NextDecade? And what's your assessment of the utility of those tax credits, and are they enough?
Well, easy. So have we been using it? No. Are we planning to use it? 100%. Are they enough? Categorically not, if you're trying to do projects on a post-combustion capture basis. So what is the utility? I think the utility today, it's very applicable for certain kinds of projects. For example, if you think about CO2 emissions from ethanol production, those projects work under 45Q. So and they're happening because of 45Q. If you think about natural gas processing, so that's in-basin processing, post-gathering, in order to get into long-haul pipeline for transportation purposes, those projects can also work under 45Q. Reason being, you're dealing with a gas that has a certain amount of low concentrations, in the case of natural gas, very high and pure concentrations in the case of ethanol, but you don't need a massive infrastructure that is required to cool these gases in order to be able to extract them with today's technologies, which is mostly amine based. So those type of projects work under 45Q. The minute you move into post-combustion capture, the level of complexity increases, and therefore your cost is no longer enough.
All right, I think we're out of time, but thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much, Andy.